The Palazzo Ducale dominates the view as your vaporetto approaches the San Marco stop in Venice. The huge building is an example of Venetian Gothic architecture, all pointed arches and quatrefoils. It's hard to believe that two prisons lie within its bulk, with a third inside the pristine white building alongside it. Tourists might be the only people who visit these prisons now, trotting along the corridors as part of organised tours. Yet in bygone centuries, notorious reputations clung to the cells, and people feared being slung into them. The fearsome reputation of these prisons may not have outlived the building, which still stands, but the reputation certainly outlived the Venetian Republic. So in this week's episode of Fabulous Folklore, let's explore this reputation, some legends associated with the palace and its prisons, and even learn of a daring escape from one of them by none other than Casanova. Hello there and welcome to Fabulous Folklore, the podcast for all things folklore, occult and just a bit weird. I'm your host Icy Sedgwick, blogger, fantasy author and your guide into these rather mysterious realms. I've got some rare things to show you, so come on in, take a look around, but be careful not to touch anything. These things sometimes bite. Well, hello there, and welcome back to Fabulous Folklore with me, your host, Icy Sedgwick. I do hope that you are well. We are continuing with the whole theme of buildings with fearsome reputations. A couple of people have expressed a little bit of dismay that we're not having a so-called spooky month this month, but obviously we did do Ghosts in August for the launch of Ghost Law, and I do have a ton of episodes already on Halloween and ghosts and witchcraft and all that kind of stuff. So I have actually put together some playlists on YouTube at least, and I haven't actually got all of the old Halloween episodes on because I obviously did them before I started putting the episodes on YouTube. But if you're listening on the main platform, there's episodes on pumpkins and broomsticks and all that kind of jazz anyway. So if you are looking for slightly more seasonal fare, there is plenty of that available anyway. And I thought with this particular theme, because of the fact that obviously we often think of particular figures associated with Halloween and that time of the year, I was kind of more interested in buildings that are quite creepy just through their reputation, or indeed fearsome through the reputations. So we started off with Bedlam and then moved on to Newgate Prison, and ultimately Enon Chapel would have been perfect in this particular month, but obviously I covered that a few months ago. So I was going to look at the Bastille, but then I actually realised it didn't really necessarily have what it was I was looking for. So I remembered a prison that I had actually visited, and I thought, well, this particular one, the reputation hasn't outlived the building because the building's still there, but the purpose of the building has changed. So I'll sneak it in that way. And that is the prisons in the Doge's Palace in Venice. Now, I visited in 2012 and can't actually remember a huge amount about it, annoyingly, but there we go. But it was still the fact that the building now is ultimately a tourist attraction. So it has obviously changed from what it was. So we are going to have a look at the legends associated with that. And yes, I did end up having to read Casanova's autobiography for this, so it just goes to show that when you do Fabulous Folklore, you can't always predict what you're going to end up researching and what sources you're going to end up using. But I thought I'd start off just quickly by explaining who the Doge of Venice actually was, because obviously Doge has taken on very different connotations of late, and this is obviously talking about a head of state. Specifically head of the Venetian state, when Venice was an independent republic until its fall in 1797. The word Doge comes from dux or leader, and the first mention of the Doge appears in the 7th century. The Venetian lagoon was a province of the Byzantine Empire at that point. But then over the next 200 years, the Doge went on to become an elected role, and any hereditary claims to the title were stamped out by about the 11th century. It was still a role for life, and the Doge basically had no power to make decisions or change the law, but he did represent the state, so he was present at quite a lot of state functions. So he'd appear at state celebrations, was part of all government bodies, but also needed permission to leave the city and wasn't really supposed to leave the palace. So it sounds like one of those jobs that had quite a lot of prestige attached to it, but actually in practice probably wasn't as fun as it might sound. So that explains what the Doge refers to. So the Palazzo Ducale, or Doge's Palace, has likely stood on its present site since the 10th century, although the building has obviously undergone various changes over that time. But as the centre of political power, the palace played a role in various administrative, legislative and judicial processes. And interestingly, people could actually seek justice by submitting an anonymous complaint via the mouth of a marble lion, which began the whole judicial process. Trials took place within the Doge's palace, so naturally the palace also housed the Venetian prison. The prison within the palace reflected how important the palace was to the justice system in Venice, and it also underscored the Republic's power and acted as a reminder of the punishments that might be meted out. It is true that every sestiere ran their own prison, so the Doge's palace remained reserved for more serious crimes, and it was kind of crimes against the state as well. But we are discussing here the prison as a single entity when in fact it could actually be broken into three. So the first prison was the pozzi, or wells, and that held those convicted of serious crimes. Many died from disease or indeed mental illness before their sentence finished. And as Casanova put it, this is where they sent, and I quote, men whom they do not wish to put to death, though they be thought worthy of it, end quote. So basically it wasn't going to be a nice place to be sent. These 18 cramped cells lay underground beneath the opulent halls of the palace. Inmates lived in damp cells, often without ventilation or light, and the cells often contained around 2 feet of water from the neighbouring lagoon. Often sharing their cells with rats, the prisoners endured conditions that reflected the might of the state, and many inmates actually left behind graffiti to detail their plight. Riccardo Pericolo, a painter imprisoned for heresy in June 1549 on the Inquisition's orders, even left engravings in cell 10, and restoration work in the 1980s uncovered them. In one image, St. Rocco, St. Benedict and St. Sebastian surrounded Mary holding baby Jesus, and in another, an angel covered an image of a crucified Jesus. Pericolo offered to make the frescoes as an act of good faith, though his terror due to the living conditions may have played a part. He never finished the work since he was released, although it is worth noting that he was finally executed for heresy in 1568. A central corridor offered constant surveillance of inmates, much like the panopticon style of prison proposed by Jeremy Bentham in the late 18th century, and when someone can see you at all times, you begin to assume that they're always watching. Then we have the second prison, the Piombi. The Piombi lay in the attic of the Doge's palace, right under the roof, and the prison took its name, Piombi meaning leads, from the slabs of lead on the palace roof. These made the prison incredibly cold in winter and unbearably hot in the summer. 4 cells overlooked the Rio de Palazzo, while 3 cells overlooked the courtyard. Here prisoners awaited trial in cramped, dimly lit cells. But the Piombi was still preferable to the pozzi. Inmates could receive food sent in from those outside the prison, and they even got a small allowance, and limited medical care was available. This is one we get quite a lot of information about from Casanova, and he discusses the way that he basically places his food order with his jailer, whose wife makes it and then brings them in. So he has quite a good dinner every day, and the money for that is obviously taken out of this allowance, and then whatever money Casanova has left over at the end of the month, he just gives to the jailer. It is quite fascinating how the longer he's there, the nicer stuff he can then start asking for. So the Piombi is obviously not somewhere that you want to end up being, but it could have been worse, if that makes sense. The cells dated to the 16th century, and they were built to house minor criminals or those from a higher social class, and to supplement the capacity of the pozzi. And a city prison on Giudecca Island replaced the Piombi in 1797. But then we have the third prison, the Prigioni Nuove, or New Prison, which was built opposite the palace over the Rio de Palazzo in the mid-16th century, and this was built to alleviate overcrowding in the pozzi. The cells enjoyed more light and ventilation, although the prison was still a harsh and unforgiving place. It accommodated up to 400 prisoners, although they were then divided up according to the seriousness of their crime. So when you're looking at the Doge's Palace from the lagoon, so as you're approaching Piazza San Marco, you've got the Doge's Palace, and then you've got a little canal, and then the building directly next to that is this particular prison. So it's really, really bright white, and it's quite impressive to look at until you realise it is a prison. But the main thing that people think of with this prison, I think, is how you got from the prison to the interrogation rooms in the Doge's Palace, and that was the Ponte dei Sospiri, or Bridge of Sighs. Antonio Contin designed the bridge, built between 1600 and 1603, and it looks like bridge design ran in the family because his uncle Antonio da Ponte designed the Rialto Bridge, and the Bridge of Sighs is Venice's only covered bridge. According to legend, Lord Byron translated the bridge's Italian name, concocting its English name based on the sighs prisoners made as they took their last look at Venice through the window. Casanova was one such prisoner, although his description of it was hardly romantic. He described how he, and I quote, crossed a closed bridge which forms the communication between the prison and the Doge's Palace, crossing the canal called Rio de Palazzo, end quote. He's a lot more workmanlike with his description about that than Lord Byron. As you can imagine, other legends have sprung up around the bridge as well, and in one, if you kiss in a gondola beneath the bridge at the moment of sunset when St. Mark's bells toll, you'll enjoy eternal love. Isn't it funny how a bridge built for access to a prison is now associated with love and romance? These three prisons all enjoyed somewhat fearsome reputations, particularly the Pozzi, and became notorious in Venice due to the conditions. But we can't talk about the Doge's prison without talking about Casanova. I have mentioned him a few times, and it was his autobiography that did help to detail the conditions in the Piombi since he spent time there. So Giacomo Casanova was born on 2nd of April 1725 in Venice, and he died in 1798. In 1755, the somewhat mysterious Council of Ten ordered his arrest thanks to his lifestyle, thinking that his lifestyle might corrupt others, although some also considered him a con man pretending to be a magician. They sentenced him to 5 years imprisonment, beginning on 25th of July 1755. The fact that he had magical texts like the Picatrix in his possession when arrested didn't help his case. He described the Piombi as including, and I quote, a dirty garret 36 feet long by 12 broad, badly lighted by a window high up in the roof, end quote. And his cell was actually off this garret, which included a torture device designed to strangle prisoners to death. Forced to bend by the low ceiling because the cell was only around 5.5 feet high, Casanova described the lack of furniture and natural light in the space. He also details placing orders for furniture and food with the jailer, accessing medical care, and the difficulties of solitary confinement. Yet Casanova also holds the honour of being the only man to escape the Piombi prison. This was no mean feat, especially when he mentions that you could only reach the Piombi via the palace or the prison buildings. You couldn't reach the cells without going through the room where the inquisitors met. Casanova explained how he escaped the prison in his autobiography, and his autobiography only really goes up to 1774, although according to the title he had actually written it up to 1797. Either way, records in the Venetian archives actually substantiate a lot of his claims about his escape. And honestly, when I was reading it, I was like, this is absolutely amazing. This sounds like something out of fiction. And it's entirely possible he may have fabricated bits of it. But as I say, there are these records that do actually go, yeah, no, this bit happened and this bit happened. So I'm going to just tell you what he said. And honestly, it's such an interesting read. But Casanova discovered that his cell in the Piombi prison lay directly above the room in which the inquisitors held their meetings, although they only met there at night. Fortunately, his jailer allowed him to walk in the garret outside his cell, and it was here that he found lots of bits of detritus that were just lying around, and one of these bits of detritus was an iron bar. After sharpening its edges with a piece of marble, he used it to make a hole in the floor under his bed. He planned to let himself down into the room below with a rope made of sheets. When he was almost ready to use the hole, he then got moved to another cell which actually had windows, although it was at this point that the hole was discovered, and his jailer was obviously not particularly impressed, and they thought, oh no, his hopes are dashed. But not really, as it turned out, because in his new cell, he actually befriended his neighbour, Father Balbi, through letters that they sent to each other hidden in the back of books. So he managed to pass his improvised iron bar to the monk, and he was then creating a hole in the ceiling of his cell, which he would hide by pasting pictures over it. And he then made a hole in the ceiling of Casanova's cell, so that Casanova could at least get out of his cell. Ultimately, on the night of the escape, which was the 31st of October 1756, Casanova moved from his cell to Father Balbi's and then made a hole out onto the roof of the prison using his pike. Casanova and Father Balbi then escaped out onto the lead roof, and there's quite a lot of discussion of how both of them basically almost fall off the roof a few times, and they've got to wait for the moon to set because otherwise it's too bright and so on. And they finally managed to lower themselves into another part of the palace. Father Balbi uses ropes made by tying sheets together, whereas Casanova has this really awful moment where he has to essentially clamber down a ladder into the window. It's far more thrilling to read in the autobiography, and the whole escape sounds incredibly dangerous. Casanova and the monk then found themselves in the palace archives, and they made their way through the palace until they reached a locked door, and this was near the grand staircase in the courtyard, so they're just metres away from freedom at this point. Dressing in the fine clothes that he'd brought with them, Casanova adopted the disguise of a reveller locked in the palace by accident. A guard saw him when he put his head out of the window and went to unlock the door, assuming that he'd accidentally locked Casanova in. So Casanova and Father Balbi then just walk out into the street. They hopped into the nearest gondola and made for the mainland. He and Balbi left the city, and Casanova was never recaptured. After 20 years, the Inquisitors invited Casanova to return to Venice, and he worked for them as a spy between 1774 until 1782. You almost feel like you couldn't make this up. It's absolutely fascinating. But it is thanks to Casanova's autobiography that many details of the Pozzi and the Piombi are easier to visualise. Honestly, I only really read that section, but it was just so easy to read and you could just picture all of it. He's got such an interesting style. Also, just in case anyone's really into occult fiction and weird fiction, Arthur Machen was the one who translated the version that I read from French into English, which I thought was quite funny. But anyway, ultimately though, we are talking about the reputation of the Doge's Palace prison. So what do we actually make of its reputation, having taken all of this into account? I think that the reputation of the Venetian prisons probably don't capture the imagination in the UK in the same way as something like London's Newgate does, and I only knew about the prisons of the Doge's Palace after visiting in 2012, so I have walked across the Bridge of Sighs, I've stepped into cells in the Prigioni Nuove and marvelled at the opulence of the Ducale reception rooms. But that said, I truly didn't expect to find some rich details about the prison in Casanova's autobiography, and his daring escape reminded me of Jack Sheppard's 2 escapes from Newgate, so I thought, isn't this really interesting that the 2 prisons that I've picked have these fascinating escapes from them? I will say his description also made me think of Edmond Dantes, the false prisoner who escapes the notorious Chateau d'If in Alexandre Dumas' The Count of Monte Cristo. So I did wonder, is this another case of fact-haunting fiction which lingers far longer in the cultural imagination? It is difficult, I think, in some ways to really find a lot of information about the reputation other than people saying they had an awful reputation. So I think some of this may have been preserved in the oral record, and then it's something like Casanova's autobiography that then makes that concrete. But I also think that obviously the fall of the Venetian Republic in 1797 has also then had an impact on the reputation, because obviously at that point prisons were then going to be used differently. The Doge's Palace then takes on a completely different role. And I do think a lot of that has then impacted how anybody visiting may see the prisons now. Obviously, all prisons kind of have a bad reputation to a degree anyway, but I think that some of these prisons have reputations of being inescapable and then someone escapes from them. And that was the thing with the Piombi. It was believed that you couldn't escape from that prison, and then Casanova proved that that was actually false and you could escape from that prison. So I think that may also be part of the reason why the reputation sticks the way that it does, because of the fact that somebody proves part of it to be wrong. I don't know. I hope you enjoyed that though. Like I say, Casanova's autobiography is really interesting, and the amount of detail that he does give us about the Pozzi and the Piombi are really interesting, and I think they do help us to see how people actually thought of them at the time. There was a degree as well where every cellmate that he ended up getting in the Piombi was like, oh, I'm only here overnight, I'll be out soon. So people clearly understood the reputation and didn't want to be there, but also seemed to have some strange idea that it was only temporary. So that's quite an interesting idea as well. But anyway, next week we are finishing up this theme with the Amityville Horror House, because I know people do quite like it when I look at popular culture, and the Amityville Horror House has affected quite a lot of things, particularly in horror cinema. So if you're interested in horror cinema, that is going to be the episode for you. I will be sharing some of the kind of ideas that I was exploring in my PhD as well. So if anyone's interested in that, that will be the episode for you. And that is basically the closest as we're going to get to a Halloween episode, because it will come out on the 25th and it will be essentially about an icon of horror cinema. So I feel like that's a good place to leave that particular theme. I will say as well, the week after, which is the 1st of November, because that's the day before All Souls Day, I thought that would be a good way to mark that would be to do the other listener experiences episode. I mentioned this a few weeks ago when I was looking at the stories people had been told about specific places, and a lot of people also left listener experiences, which I hadn't really been looking for, but I thought actually that I've got enough of those to make another episode. And I like to share those because it's a good way to preserve stuff that would otherwise get lost. So I will be doing that for that one. So if you are looking for creepy ghost stories, the episode on the 1st of November is going to be for you. So I hope that you enjoy that. And my final notice is that I also appeared on the How Haunted podcast with my good friend Rob Kirkup. We were talking about the Ghost Law book, but we're kind of chatting about lots of things to do with supernatural creatures and all that jazz. And I've put the link in the show notes if you're interested in hearing a couple of Geordies chatting about ghosts. Because let's be honest, I know some of you quite enjoy that kind of thing. And hopefully you'll enjoy the interview as well. Don't forget, next week's episode will be a little bit late because I am recording it in front of an audience, but I don't know at what point I'm going to be able to actually edit it and put it up. So it will come out at some point that weekend, but it just won't be at its usual time, but it is still coming. Other than that, though, I hope you enjoyed this week's episode, and I'll see you next week. Cheerio. Well, thanks for listening, and I hope you enjoyed that episode. If you did, feel free to leave a review wherever you listen to podcasts, because that helps other people find the show too. It also takes between 4 and 6 hours to research, write, record and edit these episodes, so if you want to help support my time in doing that, then you can buy me a coffee, or you can join the Fabulous Folklore family on Patreon and enjoy extra benefits, including exclusive episodes and articles and even illustrated talks. All the links you need are below, and thanks in advance.